Hello, everyone. Welcome to the March 23rd first Think Company webinar ever that we've thrown. Just to talk to you a little bit about what's going on here. We are Think Company. We're an experienced design and technology consulting firm based out of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. One of our folks, Dave Thomas, was going to be doing a talk at South by Southwest on the content strategy of cognitive bias, and we decided to offer this online in a webinar, and so we're presenting this now out to the public. We've decided to make this a series of webinars that we're going to be talking about. So just to cover a couple more of those, John Young, who's one of our tech leads, is going to be talking about demystifying website performance in a talk on April 1st. Our head of technology, Brian McElhaney, will be talking about process debt on software projects on April 7th. And this isn't one of our webinars, but it's still going to be a virtual event. We might be using our webinar platform for it. But if you're in the Philly area and you're familiar with Philly Chi, you're welcome to join this. Actually, because it's going to be virtual, people from all over the country can join. So all you have to do is follow us on social media, and we'll be promoting this sometime in the near future. But we're going to be doing a talk to help UX practitioners understand what other UX organizations are looking for when they're hiring. So this is part of a series of panels and that we do. And we'll have myself and Abby DePrimo, who's our Vice President of Design, as well as some folks from Vanguard and a couple of other firms in the Philadelphia area will be acting as panelists to talk about what hiring managers are looking for in the design field. So that's just some upcoming talks. There's a few more that we're going to be releasing as well, and just keep an eye on our social media to see what webinars you can attend. We'd love to have you attend as many as you want. Just for the webinar, before we go in and give this over to Dave, just want to talk about some of the ground rules. We have everyone muted by default for now. If you have questions for Dave as he goes through the talk, please post them in the Q&A space at the bottom of your screen. There's a Q&A button that you can click, and there's all kinds of upvoting and downvoting features in there. This is our first webinar, so we're going to be learning as we go along as well. But I'll monitor the Q&A space while Dave is talking, and I'll choose some questions for Dave to answer at the end in the Q&A section. I may unmute you and ask you to ask your question. If I'll try to find some way to reach out to you to make sure that you're aware that I might do that, see if that's okay. If for any reason you want to be anonymous or don't want to be heard, just let me know and I'll ask your question for you. We probably won't get to all the questions depending on how many go in the Q&A channel. And in case none go in the Q&A channel, I have a few that I prepared ahead of time just to get things started. And feel free to use the chat feature, but that's not where we're going to be monitoring for the Q&A, just so you know all that. So without any further ado, I'd just like to introduce Dave Thomas. Dave Thomas is the content strategy advocate at Think Company. He's the host of the Cognitive Bias podcast, which I think is on hiatus right now. He's a frequent public speaker on topics around content strategy and cognitive bias. And he's actually the author of an upcoming book called Design for Cognitive Bias that's going to be released this summer through A Book Apart. So without any further ado, here's Dave. Give me 1 second to hand the reins over to him.
Hello, everybody. Thank you all for coming out. Today, we're going to talk about turning conflict into collaboration using content strategy. And sorry, just orienting my mouse here. Make sure I can click on things that I need to click on. All right. Okay. So my name is David Dylan Thomas. I'm a content strategy advocate at Think Company. My Twitter handle, if you want to reach out, is @movie_pundit. And if you like to tweet while you watch these things, hashtag civil content is as good as any. And I want to start out by telling you about a little experiment that you can do if you have access to an audience. And what you do is you show an audience this image, right? A senior citizen behind the wheel of a car, and you ask the audience, should this person drive this car? And what you will generally get is a policy discussion, and you'll have a lot of people saying, oh, old people are bad at everything. Don't let them drive. And you'll have other people who say, oh, that's ageist. People can do what they want, right? And all you're going to learn by the end of that particular conversation is who is on what side. Now, it turns out you can show this exact same photo to another audience and ask them, how might this person drive this car? and you will get a totally different conversation. You'll get a design discussion. And some people will say, well, what if we change the shape of the steering wheel? And other people will say, what if we move the dashboard slightly? And what you'll learn by the end of that conversation is several different ways that that person might be able to drive that car. Now, online, we are extremely good at having that should conversation, that policy conversation. You can figure out in 2 minutes who is on what side if you go to Twitter or Facebook, right? What isn't so easy to do is the how conversation. Our platforms aren't really built for that. And we're going to spend a lot of today talking about what that difference is and how we can use content strategy and design to enable those how conversations. A good starting point is to think about the Convergence Center for Public Policy. They're a group whose job is to get people who are opposite sides of an issue to actually come to a table and talk. And we'll learn a little more about how they do that later. But first, I want to give you a quote from the founder, the president, and he's talking about why he created the Convergence Center. And he says, over a period of years, I kept meeting people of great decency who had different worldviews. But there wasn't a place where they could meet to bring out the best in each other and find answers that each hadn't considered. And there's a few key phrases in here I think we need to mention. People of great decency. I think that when we get into conflict, it's very easy for us to believe that the person who disagrees with us has no decency, right? We've come up with words for people who disagree with us in the past few years, right? So that's one thing I think we're going to need to address. Another is this notion of wasn't a place. And I think that's important because we think any location is as good as any other for a conversation, but it's just not true. Where you have the conversation, and more specifically, the design of that place, whether it's online or in the real world, really matters to the kind of conversation you're going to have. And then there's this notion of best in each other. And again, it's that assumption that there even is a best in that other person to bring out. That's something we often forget. And finally, and maybe most importantly, is this phrase hadn't considered. I think when we walk into these conversations, we usually assume we already know everything there is to know. And the only point of the conversation is to convince the other person that we're right. It never even occurs to us, oh, maybe I'm actually here to learn, right? So the environments that we currently have for these conversations look a lot like this, right? This is Thunderdome, from those of you who remember Mad Max Beyond Thunderdome, right? And it's a big gladiator, post-apocalyptic gladiator arena. And the whole phrase around it is 2 men enter, 1 man leave, right? That tends to be the tenor of most political discourse. We really think about political discourse as a zero-sum game, and it doesn't have to be. Part of the reason we think of it that way is a cognitive bias called the fundamental attribution error. And I apologize in advance, there will be many cognitive biases thrown around here. As Phil was saying, I have a book coming out called Design for Cognitive Bias, where we kind of look at that intersection. But this is one of the key ones when it comes to whether or not you're going to have a conflict or a conversation. The way the fundamental attribution error works is something like, I'm okay, you're terrible. So if somebody runs a red light, right? We will look at that person and say, oh, what a terrible driver, how impatient they must be, right? They have no respect for the rules of the road. If we run a red light, oh, I was in a hurry. Somebody behind me was honking. I had to get somewhere, right? I was late for work, right? For us, we look at the circumstances around our behavior, right? We assume we're a good person, and if we're doing something wrong, it's because of the circumstances. If we see someone else doing something wrong, we assume it's something about them personally. We don't even consider that they have circumstances, right? Now, think about this in the world of politics. There's a great podcast called You Are Not So Smart, and it's all about cognitive bias. And there was an episode where he was introducing this bias, and he did it by mentioning a routine by George Carlin, which goes something like this. Anybody who drives slower than you is an idiot. Anybody who drives faster than you is out of their mind, right? Well, think about that in the context of a political discussion. Anybody who's more conservative than me is a bigot, right? Anybody who's more liberal than me is a hippie, right? But me, I've got it all worked out. I am God's perfect creature, and if only everyone would just listen to me, everything would be fine, right? Now imagine two people who each have that mindset walking into a conversation. No wonder no one's gonna have a productive discussion. To put it another way, and I'll give you a minute to read this. So this, I think, sums up a lot of the internet, right? In fact, if aliens were to come down and try to figure out what the purpose of the internet was, just by observing human behavior, this is the conclusion I think they'd come to, that the internet is where you go to find people who are doing it wrong and then tell them they're doing it wrong. And believe it or not, this predates Trump. This predates the current political atmosphere, right? If you go back to 2014, Slate magazine created this interaction where you could go and for every single day of the year of 2014, they could find one thing that Twitter was losing its mind over. And it's this wicked little advent calendar where you can kind of click on any one of these and see, okay, on April 8th, people were freaking out about this, right? So even before we got here, we were used to using the web as a place of outrage. In fact, John Oliver set up this thing called Scream into the Void. And the idea was whatever was frustrating you, you could type it in there and then press the scream button and those words would go spinning into that void while the voice of someone screaming, right, was happening. And I feel like that's actually a public service at this point, right? And the nice thing about this is, you know, at least there's no human on the other end of that. It's just going into the void. So we've been at this high pitch for a while now. A good example of this is a few years ago, Starbucks had this Race Together campaign. And the idea was, and every time I try to explain this, it still makes no sense to me, but I'll go anyway. The idea was you would go to Starbucks and order a coffee. And on that coffee, there would be hashtag Race Together written on the coffee. And then you were supposed to talk to your barista about Rodney King. I don't know. I don't know what was actually supposed to happen. And I don't think they did either. I don't think this was very well thought through. And Twitter, of course, lost its mind. And of course they lost their mind. It was a terrible campaign, tone deaf, all the other things. But at no point did we ask, well, what would a productive conversation about race look like, right? We didn't really have anything to compare Starbucks to. We could tell on the face of it, it was terrible, but we didn't say, why isn't it more like this? There was no this there. And if we had decided to have that conversation, which is more of a how conversation, right? Well, then we could start to talk about how to have one. And I think we would have been much further along than just agreeing, oh, Starbucks is terrible. Now, if you were to have that conversation, you might land where Ronnie Poloneshky did. So Ronnie Poloneshky is a reporter here in Philadelphia, and through a series of events, she came to realize there was a human need to be heard, just to be heard. And so she literally went to an urban park in Philadelphia and set up 2 chairs and a sign. And the sign said, I will listen with compassion, without judgment, with an open heart. So, is there something you need to say? Tell me, I will listen. So she sits down, sets up the sign, and person after person after person sits down, right? And she says that what would often happen is someone would sit down and they would say, I'm just gonna take up a minute of your time. And then like an hour later, right, they had unburdened themselves, right? So this was clearly designed with the intent of having a conversation, whereas the Starbucks thing, it is unclear what it was designed to do. Ironically, I was in a Starbucks once, and there was a person who had set up a sign that said, I am a rabbi, ask me anything, in one of the booths, and I hope they were actually a rabbi. But even that sort of lo-fi thing was a much better attempt at having a conversation in a Starbucks than whatever Starbucks was trying to do. The point is, you get the conversation you designed for. And a lot of what we're going to talk about today is this notion that if you want a certain type of conversation, there are things you can do to influence whether you get it that come through content strategy and design. One of the first things you can think about is color. So it turns out that different colors have different impacts on us. And this varies somewhat from culture to culture, but one of the experiments they tried was having people complete different tasks and then changing up what color the background of that task was. So they would have someone sit down at a computer and they would either have them do like a detail-oriented task like proofreading or a creative task like brainstorming. And the results were, if you were doing the proofreading task against a red screen, you did a 30% better job, right, than if it was against a blue screen. On the other hand, if you were doing a brainstorming task, you came up with twice as many ideas if that task had a blue background than if it had a red background. So there are ways in which even the color of the website you're building or the room that you're having the conversation in can actually influence what kind of conversation you're having. Another thing is literally the objects in the room. So they've done experiments where if you are having a meeting and there's a briefcase visible in the room, people will actually act more competitive, right? They get more cutthroat. If you replace that backpack with or that briefcase with a backpack, people are friendlier, right? So even that little cue, right, that this is a business conversation makes people less friendly. And you can imagine this playing out in your web design as well, right? If I have an icon of a briefcase, that's gonna have a different indication for the user than if it's something less business-like. The same thing is very, very true about money. So anything that indicates money, a dollar sign, even the color green can do this sometime, tends to make people act more competitive. Here's a quote from one of the studies. People reminded of money are less interpersonally attuned. They are not prosocial, caring, or warm. So if your goal is to have people either online or in person have some kind of conversation that is prosocial or caring or warm, try to leave money out of it as much as possible. And we're going to do a case study later that talks about an approach to this. Now, if you think about the real world, this makes perfect sense, right? In the real world, of course, the environment impacts the conversation. If you go to a really nice restaurant and there's beautiful tablecloth and silverware and cutlery and the soft lighting and soft music playing, like this is not the place where you think it's appropriate to just drop the F-bomb as loudly as possible, right? On the other hand, if you go to a dingy bar, right, with dark lighting and loud music, you might think this place actually wants you to drop the F-bomb as loud as possible. Now, apply that to web design. If you are on Medium, right, that has these cool blues and greens and this beautiful typeface, right, you go here and you think to yourself, if I'm going to leave a comment here, I have to up my game a little bit, right? This is a classy joint. If you go to YouTube and you look at their comment section, there is nothing to indicate that I should behave myself in any way possible, right? This website wants me to leave trashy comments, right? And it's as if the web design is telling you, we put the least amount of effort possible into how this place looks, so you should put the least amount of effort possible into how you conduct yourself. I talked to someone who works at Medium to kind of confirm some of these theories, and they were like, yeah, that's definitely one of the things informing the typeface views, but even the content and the way we're presenting, right, the UX writing. So when you leave a comment on Medium, the button to leave the comment doesn't say post, it says publish. And that is deliberate because the word publish has more hoity-toity implications and connotations than just post. Anybody can post, oh, I'm about to publish. Oh, this better be good. I want to talk for a bit about the difference between collaboration and hierarchy, because that's kind of the bigger frame of what we're talking about here and the mindsets that we're going to have to go into some of these conversations with. So if you think about a hierarchical relationship, it says that there's only one way to do it and don't deviate from that, right? And it already knows the answer, right? And it's exclusive, right? When you're in that situation, there's the people who know the answer and know the right thing to do and the people who don't, right? And the people who don't are the outsiders and we don't like them. And the people who agree with us, we like them. They're on the inside. And it's also non-learning because what is there to learn? We figured this out already. We know the solution. You don't. The end. If you think about collaboration, though, it's literally the opposite. It says, here's a problem that we can solve together. And it's continually searching for better answers. It's never actually satisfied. It's like, okay, we did that better than we did last time, but you know what? I bet we can do better. Let's keep going. And it's inclusive because now it's not about insiders and outsiders. It's about people we've talked to and gotten their information and people we haven't talked to. If I see somebody new, I'm not asking myself, well, do they agree with me or not? I ask myself, well, do they have information that could help us fix this thing? Let's talk to them. And it's learning, right? Continuously. It never really has it all figured out. So there's always something new to learn. Now, if you think about the way we talk about race in this country, and I'll preface all of this by saying, this is not a conversation about how it's okay to let people say bad things. I'll reiterate that a few times. But if we think about how we talk about race in this country, it is very hierarchical. It is very much about you're doing it right or you're doing it wrong. So this is a pictographic representation of how we talk about race in this country. And I think what we find is that it's a limited approach. One of the problems with this approach is that it treats newbies like trolls, right? So if someone says something just terrible racially on Twitter, we don't actually know most of the time if they're doing it because they actually genuinely want to talk about race, but they're terrible at it, or they genuinely want to cause harm. In some cases, it's obvious, but in a lot of cases, it's like, I don't actually know what your intent was. But the default reaction on Twitter online is, oh, you said that because you're a racist, not you said that because you have no idea what you're doing. And that's the problem. We forget that speaking meaningfully about race is a skill, right? And any skill you have to practice. And what happens when you practice? You get it wrong, a lot. But Twitter allows no room for error. You cannot practice in the open. And the problem with just slapping people when they do something wrong is that it never teaches you how to do something. It only teaches you how not to. And knowing how not to do something is not the same as knowing how to do it. And the outrage ecosystem is really only good at telling you how not to do it. So picture I'm trying to teach you how to drive a car. And the only thing I do, I never say a word. The only thing I do is I slap your hand every time you do something wrong. You will never learn how to drive that car. Here's another problem. What is the opposite of a racist? What's the go-to word we have for that? The same way the opposite of up is down, opposite of left is right, opposite of racist is right. We don't have it. We have a lot of words to describe what we don't want and how to do it wrong, but we don't even have the language to describe how to do it right. And that's a problem. I can tell you as a content strategist, if you do not have a word for a thing, you are going to have a very hard time ever getting that thing. And as an example, I used to do a podcast where we would talk about how different genres, I think it was science fiction the first time out, were represented, how race was represented in these different genres. And just on a lark, I decided to Google what films will make me less racist. And here's what I got. Literally the opposite of what I asked for. And as a content strategist, this is an affront. I am morally offended by these search results because my whole job is about making sure that people can find the content that they need, right? And so to look for one thing and not only not find it, but find the opposite, right, is horrible, right? But the reason this is the result, right, is because there isn't a ton of content. There is no list of movies that will make me less racist, right? Our content is should-oriented, not how-oriented. So part of the challenge here is how do we create and structure content that's more how-oriented so you can complete that next step. And again, let me stress here, it's not that we should stop having should discussions. If someone is acting the fool online, please slap them down. It's important, but you can't really just stop there, right? The problem is if we just stop at policing speech, right, the best you can hope for is a bureaucracy, right? The best you can hope for is people just watching their asses, right? And anytime they want to say something on Twitter, submitting it to someone and saying, is it okay if I say that? Okay, thanks, I'll say that, right? I don't think that's our goal. I don't think that's our end game. Another reason that this approach, this hierarchical approach is limited is something called reactance. It's another cognitive bias. And it's basically the you can't tell me what to do bias. And the way it plays out is you can do an experiment where you have one wall that has a sign that says, please do not write on this wall. And then you have another wall, and on that wall is written, under no circumstances should you write on this wall. And you can guess which wall is going to get the most graffiti, right? This is especially apparent in America. We do not like being told what to do. Even if you look at how long it's taken for people to catch on to the whole notion of social distancing. Part of the reason a lot of people are having a problem with it is the you can't tell me what to do bias, even if it can threaten my life, right? So PC, political correctness, ran smack into this, right? Because like, you can't tell me what to do. Political correctness, that's catnip for reactance, because political correctness was focusing more on what not to do than necessarily why, right? And getting motivated to treat people well was more presented almost as a list of rules or interpreted as that. And that after a while, you start to fetishize the things that you're being told not to say. And you start to really, really want to say those things. And you could see that actually right after Obama got elected, people suddenly started feeling okay saying certain words because we had a black president. It's like, no, that's not even a little bit true. But that's reactance. So the question becomes, what can we do, right? And I would be, it would be remiss of me to say, hey, we got to start talking more about solutions and then not offer you solutions. And the good news is there is a ton that we can do. This is really fertile ground. One thing we can do is to start to call out good behavior, right? So where is that list of top 10 comments of the year, right? Top greatest online discussions of the month, right? When we do see people doing it right, you have to call that out. And the thing is, when you celebrate something, you get more of it. We're competitive people. If I see there's a list of top 10 comments and I start to see, well, how did that person get up there? I'm like, I can write a better comment than that, right? And people are incentivized to actually behave themselves if you start rewarding it. So my tiny little attempt at this is a thing called #WokeCinema that I created years ago. And the idea was every single day for a year, I would post a link to another movie that I thought was doing a good job of talking about inclusion or race or gender. And I just did one a day with this #WokeCinema. And it's me trying to build that list, right, of movies that will make you less racist. It was not a success. If you like Google hashtag woke cinema, you'll pretty much only see the things I posted. It did not catch on, but this is what I mean when I say, hey, let's start trying out ways to put more content out there that is how oriented rather than should oriented. Another thing that we saw happen is a platform called Civil Comments. And this really gets into that mix of design and content strategy approaches to crafting that conversation. So Civil Comments was a plugin where if you wanted somebody to comment on your platform, on your blog, they first had to rate 3 other comments. This did 3 things. One, it forced you, the commenter, to even realize, wait a minute, there is such a thing as a good or a bad comment, right? And then it made you apply your own standard to that. And our own standards are hugely powerful. We don't really like to betray ourselves if we can avoid it. So if I go and I look at a comment and I say, well, that's a bad comment because blah, blah, blah. And then I look at my own comment and I'm like, oh, my comment does the same things. I am highly motivated to go back and change it. There's a lot of cognitive dissonance over not doing that. And in fact, most of the people who rated those 3 comments would go back and change their comment before they posted it, right? And when's the last time you heard of someone actually going back and editing their comment before they actually posted it? The other thing it did was it made you realize, well, wait a minute. If I'm rating someone else's comment, well, does that mean someone's going to rate my comment? And suddenly you want to up your game, right? So those 3 things all conspire to make people more thoughtful about posting their comments. So that's the good news. The bad news is Civil Comments is no longer with us. And there's a resources sheet we're going to send out later, and it has a link to that whole story. But Civil Comments couldn't find a viable business model. Couldn't really get what it needed to keep going. So it's no longer with us. But the principle, all of the code, that's still there. It can still be implemented. But when I talked to Chris Alfano, who's one of the co-founding captains of Code for Philly, when I told him this story, he said, we need more tools than there are business models for. And I think that's an important thing to keep in mind with all of this. Some of these things may not be smart startup ideas. They may just be, we need to make this thing happen somehow because society needs it. Another great example is called Rethink. This was a 14-year-old, Trisha Prabhu, and she wins the Google Science competition with a platform that basically pops up a little intervention before you post something hateful. So let's say you're about to post something terrible to Twitter, and there's a little AI that kind of looks at that and judges, you know what, this is probably bad. And it pops up this little intervention that says something like, this looks like it might be hurtful. Are you sure you want to post it? 93% of the adolescents who saw that didn't post their comment, right? This tells us 2 things. 1, 93% or so of the people out there are not evil. They're just thoughtless. It doesn't occur to them there's a human being on the other side of the thing they're about to post. As soon as you remind them of that, they stop and say, whoa. Now, that means that 7% of them are, hell yeah, I want to post this hurtful thing, click, right? But that's a much smaller problem than 93%. The other thing it tells us is it just takes 2 sentences to stop them. 2 sentences, right? We're sitting here thinking, oh my God, social media is terrible. It's this rat pit. There's nothing we can ever do. It's too big a problem to solve. A 14-year-old comes up with 2 sentences to stop 93% of it, all right? We have no excuse. We can do this. Another thing you can think about is question design, right? So I was talking before about the Convergence Center, and one of their secret weapons to get people to come to the table who are on opposite sides of an issue is question design. So let's say the issue is food deserts, right? One question you might ask could be, how can we get healthier food into the supermarket? And this might seem like a good question, but the problem is it's actually pretty divisive. There are a lot of marketers, a lot of people who are buying and selling things who aren't really interested in this question and are even kind of turned off by it. However, the question they would ask would be, how can we work together to shift consumer demand to healthier consumption? You see what they did there? Shift consumer demand is very loaded language. And if I'm a marketer, right, if I sell food, right, I look at that phrase and I think, oh, wait a minute. Shift consumer demands means there's a white space. There's something somewhere where I could corner the market. Nobody's there yet because we're shifting the consumer demand. Tell me more. How can I help? How can I get in on this, right? And the phrase healthier consumption is equally loaded. If I'm a consumer advocate, if I'm an advocate for people in the community, if I live in the community, right? Oh, okay, tell me more. How can I help, right? Whoever you're trying to invite to the table can see themselves in that question. That's the magic of it. And there's one other very, very neat little trick they pulled. The first 5 words of the question. How can we work together? The very way the question is designed means you can't answer it without also talking about working together. Let's go back to the first question we asked. How might this person drive this car? It's a good enough question, I suppose, but what if I asked, how do we do a better job of moving people, right? Because that's why that guy was in that car in the first place, because he was here, but he wanted to be over there, right? And if I phrase it this way, we can talk about things like public transportation. I've seen this in my own work. So I was working with a pharmaceutical company. We were trying to develop a very broad content strategy for them and a big giant web redesign. And it meant the partnership of people who worked in IT, people who worked in legal, people who worked in marketing, and people who generally, when they did have meetings with each other, were trying to get something from the other person, and they weren't necessarily friendly, right? Very competitive, right? Very hierarchical, but we had to get them to a place of collaboration. So one of the things we did at the outset, really in the very first meeting, was to align on the bigger goals. And to their credit, we didn't have to convince them of this. They said, well, here at this company, like our highest priority is to improve health outcomes. And I said, that's great, right? So now if I have to go to the legal department and say, hey, it's taken like 6 months to approve this one change to the website, like what can we do about that? And they might say, well, I'm sorry, but our job is to make sure we don't get sued. And I could say, that's true. But what if I were to tell you your job is actually to improve health outcomes? Now, we can improve health outcomes if we're sued, but it's also really hard to improve health outcomes if it takes 6 months to approve this one little change. What can we do? By the same token, we had like the sort of marketing side of the table, and they were putting in a lot of, let's say, unnecessary content. You know how like you watch ads for drugs and there's like flowers and people running and all that stuff. Like that was on the website too. And it was like, nobody who went to the website found that helpful. And it also made it really hard to approve the content. So we could go to them and say, hey, we've kind of got this stuff here. Do we really need it? And they could say, yeah, but that's our job. We're here to sell these products. And I could say, yeah, but our real job is to improve health outcomes. And, you know, that means we need to sell the products to do that. But if it's really hard to get to the information you actually need to know about the product, that's not going to help improve health outcomes. So what can we do, right? It became this way to get everyone aligned on the same goal. When you can get everyone aligned on the same goal, it's way easier now to have those collaborative conversations because now we're all working toward the same things rather than trying to get ours. Something I think we really need to think about is creating brand new platforms. So we have platforms that are great if we want to have a policy discussion and yell at each other. And I'm not even going to say that's unneeded. It's clear that people need to vent. But when we want to take that next step of saying, okay, I'm done venting, let's solve this thing, we don't have as clear-cut tools for that, right? So this is an image of GitHub, which is a code repository, and it's designed to allow people to collaborate on code, right? And it was designed from the start to do that, right? It's not a place where you go and say, your code sucks, my code's great. No, you go there because you specifically want to collaborate and build new things. We don't really have this for public policy. We don't really have this for the kinds of constructive conversations I think a lot of us would like to have. So let's talk about what that might look like. So right now we have upvote, downvote, or just these monotone emotional reactions. But what if there was a button I could press that say, you know what, I want to collaborate on this thing. In the real world, what this might look like is something called the 8-up exercise. So this is something I've run with clients for years now. And in person, what it basically boils down to is it's a method for coming up with good ideas. So you get 8 people in a room, hence the 8-up. 8 people in a room, and you say, okay, the question on the table is, how do we do a better job of moving people around? And you say to those 8 people, okay, each one of you has 3 minutes to write down 3 ideas for how we can do a better job of moving people around. 3 minutes are up, got 8 people, each one has 3 ideas. You say, great, turn to your neighbor, show them your 3 ideas. And they're gonna show you their 3 ideas. Take those 6 ideas and whittle them down to 2. You got 10 minutes, go. All right, 10 minutes are up, and you've got all these pairs of people. They each have 2 ideas, and say, great, pair number 1, turn to pair number 2, show them your 2 ideas. They're gonna show you their 2 ideas. Take those 4 ideas, whittle them down to 2. And you can see where this is going, right? Eventually you have 8 people, 4 ideas among them, and you roll that down to 1 idea. Now, the reason this works so well, and it does work so well, they've sort of looked at this scientifically. And if you take 8 people and you lock them in a room and say, come up with a great idea, you get a mediocre idea. And if you take 8 people and say, each one of you come up with an idea, we'll vote on the best one, get a mediocre idea. But if you progressively combine ideas, you tend to get this really strong idea. And what makes it strong is a couple things. One, you know how in some of these meetings, there's this one person who just dominates the conversation, right? And you don't really hear from everybody. You just hear from like 50% that guy, and then like maybe a few of the other people. And yes, it's usually a guy, frankly. This kind of limits that, right? So if you have that one loud talker, at the first, they're not talking to anybody, and then they're really only talking to one other person, and then maybe a few other people, right? And so their influence is really diminished for most of that, right? So that's one benefit. Another benefit is you're getting kind of the DNA of every individual in that final idea as it's been progressively combined and added. And I've seen really interesting results from this. One of the most notable results is the Netflix prize. So a few years ago, Netflix had a competition, and they said, if you can improve our recommendation algorithm by 10%, we will give you $1 million, right? So all these people got into it. The winning idea came from a team that was actually formed from two different teams. There were two different teams, and they both realized they each had a piece of the puzzle. They combined their approach, became one team, and won the prize. And not only that, the team that came in second was also a combination of two other teams. Like, I can only imagine what would have happened if all four teams had combined into one team, but it's just a very great way to generate ideas collaboratively. So this is generally something you do in person. The question is, how do you scale that, especially at a time like now where you have to do something like this online? And it's funny, for a long time when I've been giving this talk, that's just sort of been an open challenge to the audience. But now I think I've found something that comes pretty damn close. So this is vTaiwan. vTaiwan came about a few years ago. Taiwan was in the middle of a struggle. There was a new tax law that they were introducing, and it was going to give China much more power over Taiwan. And it's very similar to the conflict you're seeing play out in Hong Kong right now. So students occupied, like it was a huge protest. Students actually occupied Parliament. And instead of pulling out the rubber bullets and tear gas, the government said, you know what, we want to collaborate with you. And they created a position in the government, literally, they pulled one of the people out and gave them that position to say, okay, your job is to help us collaborate on a solution. And from that, you got this process called vTaiwan. And the way vTaiwan works is you have like an issue or an idea, and you spend the first kind of part of this project really getting input from the people affected to understand what is it we really want to solve for here. So one of the first things they did was they tackled ride sharing, right? What are we going to do about Uber, right? And it's the same problems that every city has with Uber, right? What is this going to do to the taxi industry? Is this actually fair for workers? Is this safe? All of those issues, right? And so they had a round of just figuring out, okay, well, what slice of that do we really want to focus on? And again, everybody gets to contribute to that in this very collaborative way. And then once everyone's kind of contributed, you have this phase that's more face-to-face, where you really start to refine that issue into an actual actionable policy. And then the government literally votes on it. There were a couple design elements to how they did this that I want to focus on. They used, for the part where you have to figure out from the public what that main area of focus is going to be and come to that consensus, they used a tool called POLIS, POL.is. And it's basically just a survey tool, but it does a couple of it makes a couple of very clever design choices that utterly change the conversation. The first design choice is they do away with the reply button. I cannot stress enough how big an impact that has. So if they have a statement, right, in those early days of saying, okay, here are the things we want to understand, and you have maybe 4 different groups who are having this discussion. It could be Uber drivers, taxi passengers, and Uber passengers, right? And you ask them all the same question, right? And it might be something like, I believe that everybody who does ride sharing should have to get a license to do that. And you just find out the opinions around that. There is no reply button. If you get that message, all you can do is agree, disagree, or pass. That's it. Now think about what that does to trolls. A troll is someone who is going to go into that environment with the sole purpose of getting a rise out of you. They just want to make people angry. And the way they'll do that is if they see a statement like that, they'll reply to it with some horrific, sexist, racist, terrible thing, the worst thing they can think of, just to get people angry at them and have more replies and more replies. But there's no reply button. All they can do is agree, disagree, or pass. Another thing a troll might do is just create a new statement, which is something you can do. And a lot of the people who would disagree would create a new statement stating their opinion. But if you want to do that in a way that's just going to get people riled up and say some extreme hateful stuff, you can do that, but you're not going to see anybody's reaction because there's no reply button. Just that one design choice has huge implications for the tenor of the conversation. Let me show you something else they did. So they've incentivized consensus, added friction to trolling, but then they also managed to create a way to see the consensus build. So when you react to something, you can start to see how different groups are reacting as well, right? So you have a statement and you can see how this group of people, maybe those are the Uber drivers, are reacting, and maybe a bunch of them agree to something and then the other groups don't agree. And what happens as you do that repeatedly, and you see who agrees with what and who doesn't agree with what, is you start to see things that multiple groups agree with, right? And the things that multiple groups agree with tend to be more nuanced, less extreme statements, right? So again, you're not rewarding the sort of extreme polarizing yelling. What you're rewarding is the more subtle, inclusive conversational things. And as those agreements start to happen, two groups become one group, right? And so after a while, the groups represented were no longer Uber drivers, taxi passengers, and Uber passengers. There were two groups, pro-Uber and anti-Uber, right? And then eventually people start to find statements that people who were both pro-Uber and anti-Uber agreed with. And there were statements like this: we should introduce the same 5-star rating system to order taxis because the thing that ensures Uber's quality is its rating system. It is not anything else. So if the government mandates all the independent taxis and fleets to introduce the same system, we can get the same quality and then Uber doesn't become a problem. Now, this is not a solution you get to by a bunch of people yelling at each other on Twitter. You get to the solution by having a system that optimizes for statements like this, as opposed to a system that rewards extreme statements. And as a matter of fact, this became the policy. They basically took the software that was running Uber and they installed it in the taxis. And this is something that even Uber could agree to, right? And this is what happens. By the way, this whole process took something like 4 weeks. This is what you can achieve when you design for a conversation as opposed to designing for a fight. And a blogger, Tom Atlee, and I'll link to, he had a whole blog series about this, and I'll link to it in the resources that you're going to get later. One of the quotes he had, which I thought was great, was that for wisdom, we need to treat our differences as a resource that can help us consider more of what needs to be considered. In the wise democracy paradigm, defeating an opponent rather than tapping and integrating their piece of the truth is a tragic waste. And I think that brings us back to an initial piece, right, of that notion of it's not about winning. It's not about fighting. It's not about defeating. It's not about a zero-sum game. It's about we've got a problem. We need to solve it. And when I see you, I'm not going to look at you as an opponent. I'm going to look at you as someone who might have a piece of information we need to solve it. Another phrase you use that I love is difference between generating winners and generating wisdom. You have to choose. Another place you see this play out in public policy is something called problem-based procurement. We've seen this in Philly. It's also been played out in Moscow and a few other places. And the idea is usually when you're doing procurement, which is basically a city needs something, here's how it asks different vendors to give it to them. That process usually looks something like, if we need new streetlights, it'll be something like, here's a 100-page RFP, request for proposal, and it specifies the height of the lights, how many lumens they have to put out, how much power they use, how far apart they need to be spaced, blah, 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 blah. It describes the solution in great detail, and then it puts it out to the same 5 vendors it always goes out to, and whoever bids the lowest gets it. And the result is maybe slightly better streetlights than you had before. Problem-based procurement says, it's dark at night and we would like to see. Go. That's it, right? Now anybody can play. And if the best solution and the most cost-effective solution turns out to be, let's give everybody night vision goggles, great, that's what we'll do, right? But it allows for innovation, it allows for collaboration. And not for nothing, and this, like, there have been studies in this, it actually leads to shorter RFPs. So they usually go from like being 100 pages to like 18, because it takes less time to describe the problem than it does to describe the solution. Another really important factor that we cannot gloss over when we talk about collaboration versus conflict is power, especially in the world of design. Power is a very difficult thing to discuss, but if you don't discuss it, you will end up leaving people out of that conversation, and you'll have a richer, more fruitful conversation if they're there. So participatory design is very similar to human-centered design or design thinking in terms of the talk to people, then build something kind of approach and iterative pieces. All of that stays pretty much the same, but the key difference is you are being very conscious and thoughtful about power during that process. So one of the first things you do when you're engaged in this, and I'll link to this article, which is about how the Office of Open Data and Digital Transformation collaborated with Philadelphia's Office of Homeless Services to improve the services that the city was offering people experiencing homelessness. This is the case study. One of the first things you do when you're wanting to take this approach is you create a matrix, right? And that matrix is all about power. And one axis is how much power does the individual have, and another is how much impact do they have. And if we're designing service design for people experiencing homelessness, the people who are experiencing homelessness will almost always fall in the high impact, right? They're very highly impacted by whatever we design, but also in low power, right? They have very little decision-making power in what gets designed. The same thing is true generally of the people who are providing those services. They're a little bit higher in power and a little bit lower in impact, but they're still basically in that lower right quadrant. What is so audacious about participatory design is it says, you know what, we're going to take those people out of that lower right quadrant and move them into the high power, high impact. We are going to make the decision makers the people who are going to be impacted most by this design, right? And in a way that's almost revolutionary. It seems weird to say so, but generally speaking, like, let's be honest, design is a business. Generally, the person writing the checks is the person who has the most power, is the decision maker in that design. What participatory design encourages, at least, is how much power can you give the people who are actually impacted by the design? So in the case of the city, right, the people with the high power would be the public officials, right, who have control over the budgets, right? And what participatory design says, hey, what if we flipped that? And what if we had the public be the ones who are the final deciders? So this is a stakeholder ladder, and it's a tool that people who are using participatory design use to understand when to bring people in that lower quadrant in to the design process, right, and hold themselves accountable. This is in the link to the case study that I'll send, but if you want to study it more later. But I think the most impactful pledge on the right there to the public is in the upper right, that says, we will implement what you decide. Now think about that for a second. You're saying to the people who are frontline, the people who are in fact impacted by whatever design they come up with, you are the ones who actually get to finally sign off, are we gonna do it this way or not? And I think this is especially important in the realm of public policy because that's kind of how it's supposed to be. It's a democracy. Like, you're supposed to be the people who get to decide what happens. But in practice, that just doesn't usually happen. So that's why it's something that I think is a very powerful way to think about power when you're trying to construct these conversations and construct these designs, is how do we make sure that we're also accounting for power when we're trying to create these collaborations. Finally, there's one big case study that I want to walk you through that'll kind of take some of the different things we've talked about and show them how they look in practice. And this case study revolves around someone we're going to call Francis, because I can't use their real name. I'm going to be a little bit cagey about all this, but I promise you this actually happened. So Francis works for a group whose job is to help a large cohort of people from all across the spectrum decide how to spend federal funds that impact a vulnerable group in a major metropolitan city, right? So federal funds are set aside to say, hey, here's a group who really needs our help. We're going to create a committee who's going to decide how to spend those funds, and they're going to meet every few months and decide how to spend those funds. Anybody who's lived in the world of public health will not be shocked when I tell you that this group suffered from something called status quo bias. So whenever they got together to decide how this budget was going to get spent, they spent it exactly the same way they spent it the last time they met, which is exactly the same way they spent it the last time they met. And the problem is the needs of this group, right, that they were spending the money to help change over time. Right? And it may be that the thing they're spending money on now doesn't need money anymore, but this other problem, this other fire has come up and it needs to be put out. But they're stuck spending the money the way they always did because it feels safe. That's what status quo bias is. You do what you did before because it feels safe. What I'm going to talk to you about now is how they used both the design of the agenda, which we can almost kind of call the content strategy of the meeting, and the design of the physical space to help get them over status quo bias. So if we think about the old agenda, what would usually happen is at the beginning of the meeting, they'd be presented with this massive document, right? And they would be walked through that document, and the document has all these budget spreadsheets and these charts and graphs and these needs assessments, and they would walk through that, and then there'd be a Q&A. And there would be no Q, like no one would ask any questions because they've just been handed a massive document. And then they would go through this working lunch where they would figure out the budget, and of course they'd land where they always did. The new agenda, the first change they made was the initial document had no budget numbers in it. It only talked about needs. What does the community need, right? And as we talked about before, as soon as you bring money into it, people become less interpersonal. And when you're trying to spend money on a vulnerable community, you don't want to be inhuman, right? You want to be like much more cooperative, much more creative, right? You want to see people as people. The second you start throwing around dollar signs, people actually stop looking at people like people. So they said, we're not going to talk about budget. In fact, we're not going to talk about dollars and cents until the very, very end. So they're looking at this budget-free document. And then even before that, in between these big meetings, they would have data training where they sat down and walked people through charts and taught them how to really read these charts and what to look for, how to understand what was being represented, how to understand what wasn't being represented. And this meant when they finally got all that material, they could really engage with it. And because they could really engage with it, the Q&A had actual questions. People felt empowered to ask questions. And seeing other people ask questions meant even more people felt empowered to ask questions. So it became a very fruitful Q&A session. Then they used a version of the 8-up exercise we talked about, where you had a small group get together and talk about their community's needs. And then that would merge into a larger group talking about more needs and a larger group until you finally were able to come to a consensus around a key set of needs, right? And again, we haven't talked about money yet. The next step was to look at that big list of needs that everyone agreed on and said, okay, let's see which of these needs are actually about money and which ones aren't. Because again, there's a presumption, well, it's all gotta be about money, right? No, let's actually figure out which of these aren't budget issues and get them off the table so we can focus on the things that can actually be impacted by money. Then they had a non-working lunch. And one of the things you have to know whenever you're organizing meetings is people think on their stomachs. There's a bias called decision fatigue. And the way it plays out is as you go throughout the day, making decisions actually uses up energy. And by the time you get to the end of the day, if you haven't replenished that energy, you're going to make crappy decisions, or you're just not going to make decisions. So one way this plays out is judges who are making parole decisions. If you chart the decisions at the beginning of the day, it's pretty even if they will or won't give you parole. By the time it gets to right before lunch, they're almost giving nobody parole. And then after lunch, suddenly it jumps back up again and it's pretty even. And then by the end of the day, it's back down to nothing. So if you're ever up for parole, just pray that you go right after the judge is eaten, because it literally makes a difference, which is scary, right? We hope our judicial system doesn't work that way, but hunger is real. So they had a non-working lunch so that people could eat and be full before they had to make financial decisions that were going to affect people's lives. And then finally, we get to the budget decisions. So that's the sort of content strategy aspect of the design. But another key piece was the space design. So the room they were having these meetings in was this big sort of lecture hall style place that just had too many chairs and tables. You could not move around. And if you can't move around a space, you will feel less creative. You will feel, if you feel confined, you don't feel free to be yourself. You make more conservative decisions. It's just, you are less likely to collaborate. So people need to feel like they have room to move. They also really had some nice big windows in this space, but you couldn't get to them because of all the chairs. So you couldn't take advantage of that. The seating style was sort of like rows, like lecture style, which created this weird power dynamic between the people presenting and all the audience who were actually supposed to be the collaborators. There was no green space, basically. There was nothing living in the room. And it didn't feel like a space that was used by humans. And I think people can resonate with that, right? Like, I think we've all been in these collaboration spaces that looked like they were actually made for robots and not for people. And again, these are people who need to be able to be open with each other and talk to each other like humans. So anything that detracts from that is a problem. So Francis had read this book called Joyful by Ingrid Fattel Lee that talks about different ways to have joy. And one of the chapters focuses on the design of spaces and how much of an influence that can have on your mood. After having read that, she and her team in one day made all these changes that changed the game. So one thing they did was they realized, okay, we've got 100 chairs in this room, 50 people show up for these meetings. Let's get rid of those extra chairs, right? And that opened up space. There's more room to move, people feel more free. And it also meant, okay, now we can get access to those big windows and put some comfy chairs there, right? And so you have access to that light. They went to a more semicircular chair arrangement that meant people could kind of face each other a little more, and it feels more like a collaboration and not a presentation. And they added plants, right? There are living things in the room now. It feels more human. My favorite detail is they had this coat rack that was in the back of the room, and nobody ever used it. They brought it to the front of the room so people could put their coat on it when they walked in. But they found that if they just put the coat rack at the front of the room, people still wouldn't use it. What they had to do was take like their work sweaters and put them on the coat rack to kind of seat it. And then when people saw there were already sweaters on it, then they would use it. And it may seem like a trivial detail, but a coat rack with coats on it makes a space feel like humans actually use it. Like this is a space for human beings. And that has a huge psychological impact on what you're free and open to do and say in that environment. All of these different factors meant that ultimately, once people met, and again, the actual needs hadn't changed, but the way they were, the frame, the way they were being presented they actually started spending money differently. They started making decisions that were different than the decisions that had been made before, and in the opinion of the people working this, were better decisions that were more helpful for the community. And anyone who's ever worked with a diverse set of stakeholders who are very conservative in how they spend money, if you're actually able to get them to change their minds about that, you know that that's almost impossible. So when I say this is a big deal, it's a big deal. So there's a quote from Eric Bogosian's talk radio that I love. It says, "Marvelous technology is at our disposal, and instead of reaching up for new heights, we try to see how far down we can go." Now, he was talking about radio. This is from the 80s, but he might as well have been talking about today's technology, right? So in the interest of going higher instead of lower, let's just establish 3 rules of productive discourse. Rule number 1 is neither of us has the answer, right? If we walk in there thinking we have the answer, we failed already, right? And if we had the answer, well, we probably wouldn't need to have this conversation in the first place. Second, and this is hard, but you gotta commit to it, neither of us will win, right? Because that's not what we're here to do. And by the way, winning doesn't really help. All it does is make one of us feel better until the same problem rears its ugly head again because we were too busy winning to solve it. And finally, we're here to create something new. This assumes the best in each of us and that we both have something new to contribute to this thing that hasn't been there before. So the next time you see somebody doing it wrong, ask yourself, is there a how conversation to be had? Thank you. And now I think we have time for questions, I hope.
All right. So you know what? There's in the Q&A section, there's a couple of questions in there. We're right at the end of the time, so I think I'll ask the first one. It was upvoted a couple of times. And it was asked by an anonymous attendee, so I'll ask it myself, but I'll read it word for word. And this is, we've all just been thrust into a world of working virtually. Some of us are used to it. Some of us are just learning what it's all about. How would you recommend the noobs and veterans approach our new collaborative reality to maintain the most civil environment?
So I think the rules for productive discourse don't change that much when we're online, right? It's still going to be about walking into it with an attitude of curiosity and not defensiveness, and that I'm not here to win this conversation, right? I'm here to actually have a contributive, collaborative thing. I do think, and it's ironic because this particular setup doesn't allow for it as much, but I think it's important to leave your camera on, right? I think it's important to see the other person visually. Remember we were talking before about how people can post hateful things when they don't know there's a human being on the end of it. I feel like you can say some pretty hateful stuff if you don't actually see the human you're saying it to. So I think that's just one pro tip, leave the camera on, right? See the other human's face when you're doing this kind of work. And I think all the other pieces are also important. Just making sure, I secretly want to convince Zoom to build a function that measures how much time everyone, if it's meant to be a collaborative meeting, how much time each person speaks, and have them have an allotment, and if they use it up, their mic shuts off. Because another thing that can happen is it's very easy, and I say this as the person dominating the conversation, but it's very easy for one person to dominate the whole conversation, and a lot of valuable things that are coming from people who are more introverted or who don't feel they're being given permission to speak just don't have. And it's something you can do just not because you are feeling bossy, but because you just don't even realize you're talking so much. If you could see how much you were talking relative to everyone else, I think that would have a huge impact. And if everyone were given the same allotment to do that, I think that would contribute to a more collaborative virtual conversation.
Yeah, what a great idea. Like the, like timed chess. Like you've got your timer and you're tapping your timer and it's counting down. We know it's a 30-minute meeting. Everyone, all 3 people get 10 minutes in the meeting. Then then what a great idea. We should send that to our Zoom folks, see if they can code that in.
Yeah, Zoom, call us.
Yeah. Hey, Dave, someone asked really quickly in the chat if you could jump to the last slide really quickly.
Sure.
While you're doing that, maybe I'll queue up the next question. And I know you have a few things to go over as we get out, so maybe I'll ask the last.
Did they mean this slide?
I'm not really sure. They said back to last slide, please. Yep, that's the one. And so while that one's up, all right, so I know Barry could not stick around to ask this question, but the question is, we did the digital problem solving recently. This is when your tree exercise came up. Using Zoom breakout rooms recently in a workshop to solve problems, 2 together, then 2 different ones together, then 4 together. Would love to hear you talk about thinking first. So I think it's, I'm not sure if that's exactly worded well enough for you to understand, but I think it's about like how about giving people time to think before you go into this process?
Oh yeah, and you know what? I left something out that I really shouldn't have, is that in between each of those steps, so the first step of like, hey, you've got 3 ideas, come up with the thing, 3 minutes to come up with 3 ideas, that is meant to be fast. Like you're meant to just creative juices going. After that though, when you go into those sessions where it's like, okay, the 2 of you have come up, whittled down to 2 ideas, you're really supposed to take another 10 minutes to just work on those ideas. So that is, you know, for the purposes of time, I didn't get into that, but when you're doing it right, you actually do have these moments before you present to other people or your team presents to the other team to really think through that idea and make it richer. And I'm not sure if that's what they were referring to, but that is a very important step. Great.
I know you have a couple of slides to go to in the end to close out, but I figured why don't we get to the last question that was asked, and then maybe we can that was asked in the question panel, and then maybe you can jump to your slides. The stuff in Dave's final slides is also being fed through the chat channel. If you have to go, then you can go in and check out. There's some links and things in there for you to follow up on. So another anonymous attendee asked, when it comes to design in school, I'm a student here, how do you recommend collaborating on a project strictly through screens when we as students are used to engaging in person with our professors, touching the design and giving crits based on how it looks and feels in person? How do we all do that online and from home?
So this was literally my first job. The first job I had on the web was for an online distance writing course for the Center for Talented Youth. And this was like junior high and high schoolers from all over the world who had tested well in writing. And we had a CD-ROM, if you remember those, that we sent out that was a college level creative writing course, narrative nonfiction writing course. And what would happen is you'd get a writing assignment and then you turn it in, and I as the TA would like grade it, but we'd also have, we'd pick 2 or 3 to workshop. And the way we would workshop is we had just a good old fashioned forum, and people would discuss in the forum the work, and we had sort of like constraints around how to do that. And it wasn't as good as a Zoom conversation would have been, but it was enough, right? It was enough to sort of get the feedback from these people. And it worked so well that we started getting requests from the students for us to create new forums to talk about non-academic stuff. So I remember distinctly setting up one for like movies and one for politics or something. And then I set up one that was like, hey, suggest a topic. And the overwhelming vote was for sports. And I realized, oh, I'm not into sports, so I didn't think of it, but clearly other people are. So we created a sports one.
That's great.
But I mean, in that was, you know, obviously not COVID oriented. That was more, hey, you live on the other side of the world oriented. But the same principle applies, right? You get to get this feedback from your peers about the things you're doing. And at least for like writing and humanities type of courses, I felt like that was a pretty effective approach, and not as ideal as face-to-face, but it was getting there.
Yeah, that's great. And I'd love to add to that, just for the student who asked this question, again, anonymously, so I don't know who it is, but we've noticed that, you know, we've been working a lot more with our clients remotely for design reviews and things like that aren't directly close to us where one of our studios are. So getting used to having a design review virtually and using the tools that are built within these virtual platforms is really important. So maybe practicing that with, you know, with some of your fellow students, you know, when you're leading up to a crit or leading up to a jury or something like that, to just jump into something like Zoom or Hangouts or whatever you have access to in your school would be really helpful for you, because facilitating online seminars it's not just a phenomenon of you know, the past month or so. It's something that's pretty common out there. there's more questions coming in now. So
I'm cool to hang out if people are cool to hang out.
that's great. I'm cool to hang out too. So again, like go to the chat if you want to see what the final links are, and we'll definitely close this out by 4:30. But another person asked a question directly in the chat window that I thought was really interesting. Maybe this will blindside you a little bit, Dave. But their question is, and this is something very common in the Philadelphia area. If you're an attendee not in Philadelphia, just how do we solve the injection site problem in Philadelphia? So to give people background, there's a movement in Philadelphia to try and open injection sites for people with addiction so that they can get they can inject in a safe place. And there's some evidence from other cities around that. But what we're learning is when the city tries to find a neighborhood where they can open an injection site, then everyone in the neighborhood really, gets worked up because they don't want that kind of thing in their neighborhood. So how do we get this how do we use your principles, Dave, maybe to address the sort of NIMBY, issues around a really hot button topic like that?
So I'm going to suggest an experimental approach, and I say it's experimental because I know in theory it should work. I do not know if anyone has tried it. So I forget the name of the bias, but it's basically a bias where if I can get you to do a small thing, I can get you to do a big thing. And the example would be there's an experiment where you ask somebody, hey, can I put this big giant honkin' sign up on your lawn? I don't know, for like a dry cleaners. I don't know what it is, whatever. And most people will say no, right? On the other hand, if I come up and say, hey, can I put this tiny little like door hanger on your thing? Can I just this tiny little thing there? More people will say yes to that than will say yes to the big giant honkin' sign thing. But then if I come back and say, how's that door hanger working out for you? Hey, do you mind if I put this kind of giant sign up on your thing? They are way more likely to say yes to the giant sign because what's happened is now they're sign people.
Yeah.
It's I forget the name of it, but it has to do with self-consistency. It's a self-consistency bias. So if in the past we can look back and see a moment where we did a thing, if we have to do a bigger version of that thing, we're much more likely to do it because again, we don't like being inconsistent with ourselves if it's obvious. So we will go for it. So if you can say, hey, I know you don't want a big injection site here, but can I just put it just a deposit, just a little mailbox where people can drop their stuff that they're done with, right? And no one's gonna hang out here and inject, and then just like that. And they're like, okay, and a lot of people will still say no, but a few more people will say yes, right? If they say yes to that, then you come back and be like, well, what if they just stuck around here and actually used it, like the place here to inject? Like, would you call that? They are way more likely to say yes because now they're injection site people.
Right.
That is my honest to God, immediate thought around that because I've seen this bias before and I'm like, oh, it would be really good to find a pro-social use for it. The other piece of that obviously is humanizing, right, the people, because most of NIMBY has to do with, I am afraid of the people who show up if this is here now, right? I feel they're in some usually non-concrete way that I can point to and describe. If these people start showing up here, something bad is going to happen. And these are not people I usually interact with. If you told them the people that were going to show up here are the same types of people who show up to their book club, they'd be like, well, yeah, sure, fine. So maybe it's about getting them in the same book club, right? To use a metaphor, right? Of actually having contact with those people. And after they've actually spent time literally hanging out with those people, right? They'll be more likely to say, yeah, sure, you can, I just went to a barbecue with you. Of course, I'm willing to let you come and help get help, right? So I think somewhere in between those two solutions is a way to use some of these biases in the favor of, and to fight the NIMBY problem.
Right. So it could even be something small, like let's open a counseling center first.
Yeah.
And then let's now that we know that there's folks that are here and have access to counseling or something like that, to give them something else, and that really makes a lot of sense to work into it incrementally. Wow, there's a lot of great questions here. I'm just going in order as they are. One is, and I think this might be in your book list, so maybe it's something you can recommend in your book list, but someone's asking for case studies or examples of successful question asking, like what kinds of guides. And that's actually a really great skill that you have, Dave, is I think everything turns into an interview with Dave when you're having a conversation with him. So like, what kind of sources do you go to for that?
So that is one thing I do talk about. So the whole middle chapter of the book is focused on the biases of our stakeholders and how do we work with and through those biases to sort of generate better results. And there's a whole section about question asking. And a lot of the examples you saw here and there. And there's a whole sort of step-by-step piece to that that just sort of lets you know how to think about that. It's really short, and I will include it in the resources section just as a little value add for you. So like when you get your email after this, open it because it'll have some cool stuff in it. But it basically goes like this. The methodology about coming up with this is whatever the issue is, right? So let's go back to the driving one. It looks like the issue there is an age issue, right? Rights for senior citizens versus not, right? And that's how it's framed. Should this person drive this car, right? And what you have to ask yourself is, what is the goal, right? I'm a content strategist. I'm always thinking, what is the goal? I'm always asking why. Why is that person in this car? Why do they need to drive the car? Well, because they want to be there and they're here. Okay, so really, isn't that the question we need to ask, is how do we get them there? Okay, let's ask that question instead. And all of a sudden, it turns from being a should question into a how question. Because now I'm looking at what are you trying to solve for? And that works kind of beautifully for hot topic issues. Let's take gun control or guns in schools. So someone says, well, should we put guns in schools? And it's like, whoa. Why would you want, let's assume that's a good idea. If it were, why would you want to do that? Oh, well, because I want to keep our kids safe. Why don't we ask the question, how do we do a better job of keeping our kids safe, right? I've now turned it into a how question, right? Because now I'm thinking about the goal, not how angry I get when I think about trying to bring guns into schools, right? There's a certain of emotional distancing you have to bring into it as well. But bringing it back to the goal tends to be a really good way to design questions, right? So if you are even, and Erica Hall talks a lot about this, when you are trying to do research, it is really, really important to figure out what are you trying to find out first. Spend more time trying to figure that out than you do trying to figure out like the actual research questions. Because if you screw up, what are we trying to find out? It doesn't matter how good your research questions are, you won't find out the right thing. And what you want to find out is always coming back to, well, what is the goal? What are we actually trying to find out here? What are we trying to solve for? Yeah. Right. So that piece of advice, I think, seeds, like if you're trying to find a shortcut guide to designing good questions, I think it really is that. How do you focus in on the right, on the goal of the issue?
That's great. Yeah. I love that. So I'm going to, and that's actually something that we talk to with our design researchers all the time, and Dave's familiar with this, that we often, especially when we're working with clients and clients want to ask all different kinds of questions because now they have an end user sitting in front of them, to say like, which of our research goals are we trying to achieve by asking this question, and really focusing down on the goals. So that's always the best approach towards any of this stuff. I'm going to try an experiment here. I reached out to Madison on a chat and she didn't respond, but she asked a question and she did not mark it as anonymous. So I'm going to mark her as allowed to talk and see if she'll ask the question. And if she doesn't, then I'll ask it myself. We're trying out this platform, so I'd love to try this out.
Hi, right. Can you hear me?
Hi, Madison.
Hi. Yeah, I was just wondering if you would consider what you do a form of advocacy, since you combine empathy and research to bring light to issues in the world.
I mean, it's yes. I mean, it's literally in my job title, but yes. I mean, I think that a lot of what I hope the book, for example, is able to do is to sort of advocate for a thoughtfulness and advocate for a certain thoughtfulness in design and give you the tools to do that. So it's sort of like, hey, here's a cool set of tools that'll make you better at thinking about the different biases that your user has or that your stakeholder has or that you have. But in providing those tools, I'm also sort of saying this is worth thinking about. It's worth thinking about those biases. It's worth thinking about what is or isn't getting in the way of that empathy. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. Thank you.
Sure, yeah.
I'm going to try this again, but I'm going to surprise like Katie Fine, and she's still in the room, and she asked a question about the participatory design example, so I'm going to see if she wants to ask her question live.
Hi, I am still.
Hi, Katie.
Hi, how are you? Thank you so much for this. This was incredible. I was just wondering, in terms of participatory design, and the example that you gave about with homelessness and bringing high impact but low power individuals higher up into the process to help make decisions and decide how things might go. And what I wondered is, what happens when that implementation isn't quote unquote perfect, and there are problems or errors or things don't go well or there's public misconception, how do you kind of bring it back to the table with people in the higher power, low impact groups in a way that doesn't end up having hierarchy sort of take over and say, well, this is wrong, so we're gonna fix it now. You know what I mean?
Yeah. I will preface all this by saying is that the right person to answer this question is Liana Dragaman and some of the great folks at the Office of Open Data and Digital Transformation. But I will do my best to speak for her. But so a couple things, right? So one is all of this ultimately does come back to a power structure, right? Because the powers that be have to sign off on that participatory design approach. Right? If the mayor says, "Oh, I don't like that approach," you can't do it. All right, you need buy-in at the highest levels, and I think part of the reason we've had a couple mayors now that I think have been pretty good at giving service designers and content strategists and folks like that access to government to try to take a different approach. So that if that buy-in isn't there, yeah, you are sunk, and if things go wrong, you're even more sunk. Right? One of the things, and if you look at that ladder chart, one of the things that is kind of key to making this work is frequent check-in, right? So that it isn't sort of like, hey, I'm going to talk to some people experiencing homelessness. I'm going to talk to some people who help people experiencing homelessness. Then I'm going to go off in a corner for a month and come back and say ta-da. No, I'm going to present them with an idea. I'm going to get their feedback. I'm then going to tell them what I did with that feedback and check in with them again and say, hey, we implemented this. We didn't implement this because of X, Y, Z. Is that okay? What should we do next, right? I would treat them the same way I would the CEO of the company that I'm building a design for, right? Like I would keep checking in with them again and again. And I guarantee something's gonna go wrong. But if it goes wrong and I'm doing participatory design correctly, it's going wrong in a way where it's something that either I missed or my, or the people I'm serving, the public missed, right? It's not because some third-party company stepped in and said, yeah, but we like blue instead of green, so it's blue, right? Like the accountability stays within that relationship between me, the designer, and you, the person I'm designing for, right? Does that make sense? And is that kind of what you were asking about?
I think so. I think so ultimately. And this sounds very familiar to me with some user experience principles that I've been that I've sort of been studying over the last year about feedback and check-ins and iteration.
Yes, there is. If you read the article, and again, you'll get the link in the email to the article the city wrote about this, but there's a lot of space devoted to feedback as being crucial to this process working.
Katie, one other tip that has worked out really well for us that you may be already practicing if you're in the UX research world is we publish regular field notes for our clients when we're doing field research, and that adds to this participatory part of it. Often, the executives that we work with just are way too busy to be in any observational state with any of the research that we do, but they tend to consume those field notes ravenously. And they become big advocates for what's being learned as things as research is conducted. So maybe that helps you. Maybe you're already doing it, but for other folks who are listening, and that's a practice that's been really helpful for us.
Thank you both so much.
Sure.
I'm gonna let me see. Well, Sabrina was the student, and she has a question. Now she's outing herself as the student who was asking the original question. So I'm going to let her ask her question.
Hi, thank you for the question that you answered of mine earlier. It was super duper helpful, especially during this really weird time that a lot of my peers are kind of having to deal with for the first time ever. So I have another question, and I was really intrigued by your whole section on space design. And I actually relate to it a lot because before this all happened, I and some of my friends in our BFA program had multiple spaces that we had access to at school, and now we're just confined more or less to our homes, whether it's with our family or an apartment that we already own. And I want to know how I can use the concept of space design from affecting my work, because more or less I'm confined to my bedroom and I can only rearrange it so many times, make it accessible to my work so many times. The biggest thing I've done is I got another monitor, and now it's like, well, now what? Because I'm still in a slump. I can't seem to just do it for more than an hour, and then I get overwhelmed almost. Like I feel like I can't move forward because this isn't school. I can't just crash in my lab and do work for 2.5 hours. I can only do it for a limited amount of time before I feel stuck. And then the cycle repeats. So is there a way that I can take your concept to like prevent it and keep moving forward during this super duper crazy time?
Yeah, I think there are a few just disparate elements to bring together, but the thing you sort of want to focus on is like, what do you want to optimize for in that space? Is it creativity? Is it productivity? Right? Because that might subtly influence like how you want to design that space. Or, I mean, it sounds silly, but do you want more red things in the room or more blue things in the room? Right? Like all of them could potentially. So the first thing for you to think about, I think, in that is like, well, what is the thing that I want to make sure that I'm getting out of this space? Like creativity, productivity, whatever it is. That having been said, if it's creativity, I think it's important to find a way to make the space as movable as possible, or at least give yourself the illusion of freedom of movement. So just make sure if you have a floor, it's as clean as possible, right? If you have a desk space, it's as uncluttered as possible. You feel like you have space, like you're not, basically remove anything that makes you feel confined.
Yeah.
Right? If that's the thing. If there's any way to get access to light, do it. If there's any way to get access to green things, do it. These are all things that sort of just make you feel like you're not trapped. But basically, the more the room looks like a prison cell, the more you will feel like a prisoner and the less work you'll be able to get done. Right? So that's one piece to think about. The other thing, though, that you shouldn't discount is, depending on what work you're trying to do, frequent breaks aren't necessarily bad. So there is, and again, I'm gonna blank on the name of the bias. I used to do a cognitive bias podcast, and like we literally covered more than 100. So it was fun, but I don't remember all the names. But there is a bias that is very much about memory and how we construct memories. And let's say you're trying to study for a test. If you cram, I'm trying to remember how this is. I think if you like just look at it, look at the material for like 5 hours and just beat it into your head, you'll do okay. If you take frequent breaks, I'm gonna have to double check. I think this is true. You actually do a little bit better. Because it gives your mind time to kind of process and accumulate the knowledge by having a few like more frequent breaks in there than if you're trying to, like, basically your mind fills up. Like you just can't put any more water in that jug. So you need to like let it soak in, right? Do something else for a while, then come back to it, and then you're fresh and you can start to integrate it better. I'll have to double check that, but the last time I remember like doing that episode, that was sort of like the weird anomalous result they found. It's like, oh, taking those breaks and getting that sleep and doing those things, you actually are, you will learn the material better than if you try to just cram it all into your head all at once. Now, I don't know if that's the type of work you're doing, but depending on the type of work you're doing, frequent breaks might not be terrible.
I actually really like that, especially because I'm here because I'm doing UX and UI design for my capstone project. So I'm doing like all Adobe XD. As of right now, I had a lot more physical components, but that doesn't seem possible anymore.
Yeah.
Makes sense. So that's super duper helpful. And I do need a lot of creativity boost. So do some of my peers. So I'm going to share that information with them. Thank you so much for answering my questions.
Thank you, Sabrina. So I think we're getting really low on time. There's a request. Actually, someone's asking about if you could go back to the slide that shows the cover of a book that included information about designing delightful spaces.
Yes, and we'll link to that book in the resources email we're going to send out later. But I will find that it's a cool cover. Yep.
So yeah. So there is a book list. It's actually in the chat thread right now. And then I think maybe we'll close it out. There's a couple of other questions in here that I don't think we're going to get to, and I apologize for that. But Dave, if you just want to get to the closeout section, we can.
Oh yeah. So there's the cover. It's called Joyful, and we'll send a link to the book in the email. So you know that part of the, like when you're at a conference and after it's over, people come to the front and they like chat with the speaker. So we can't do that here, but what we can do is have virtual coffee. I'd love to get virtual coffee with you sometime and chat about what this sparks for you and what kind of questions you might additionally have. and how you might be trying to tackle some of these issues. So we're going to send out, it's in the chat now, the link, and you can just sign up, tell us your name and basically what you want to talk about, and we'll kind of get back to you and try to find a time that works. So that's one thing I want to let you know, making myself available for that. And yes, I am writing a book. It's called Design for Cognitive Bias, and it's going to come out this summer from a book apart. If you'd like updates on that or other kind of virtual things I'm working on, there's a link for a email list. I promise I will not spam you. I just don't have the time. So I will send you information about the book through that, and you can get updates that way. And again, there's a link in the chat for that. And then next week, we are continuing this webinar series with John Young, who's going to talk about how fast is fast, demystifying website performance. And let me tell you something, even if you don't know much about website performance, just like go anyway, because I know John Young, I've seen him present before, and he's kind of amazing. Like, he's one of those people who, like, he could be there talking about, like, you know, knitting or ants or whatever. It doesn't matter. Like, I would just want to hear him talk about it. So I highly, highly recommend you show up. It's April 1st, 3:00 p.m. And there's a link to register for the webinar in the chat. And again, when we send out the follow-up email, you'll get that opportunity as well.
Dave, thank you so much for taking the time for this. I can't thank you enough. This has been great. Thanks everyone for the remaining 22 attendees for sticking around for the Q&A session. Thanks for attending. That's we've had some great numbers for this, and I can't agree with Dave more. It's great listening to a Dave Thomas talk. It's amazing listening to a John Young talk as well. He can make anything interesting for, you know, hours on end. So we look forward to seeing you at future webinars, and if you have any feedback on this, feel free to reach out to us and let us know how it went. And thanks everyone for showing up.